going to be really tight. Okay, we're live now. Good evening and welcome to the opening of Evidence Week in Parliament. I'm delighted to be bringing this to you with our partners, the Institute of Physics and the UK Statistics Authority, and many, many more people from across Parliament, inside, outside Parliament, evidence advocates and members of the public who will be leading us through their questions. Before I introduce the panel from within Parliament and the experts from outside and within Parliament who are going to help to answer those questions this evening, I just want to say a few words about what we're going to be doing this evening and Evidence Week. It's a common complaint that MPs in particular aren't scientists, that we have some scientists in the House of Lords, but we don't have that many in the House of Commons. And when I look at the daily bulletins from Parliament and the subjects they go through, it's everything from economic forecasts to the feasibility of supporting electric cars, to border controls on livestock, or inequalities in education. And I do wonder to myself what kind of degree you would have to be across all of that. The crucial point, it seems to us at Sense About Science, is that, and the one that the voters, I think, and the specialists care about, is are you getting behind how things appear to find out how they really are? Are you understanding developments? And are you predicting their impact and the impact of policies? So there are two questions that the opening of Evidence Week is focused on this evening. Is Parliament doing that? And is it using the fullest range of resources to help? And there may be some questions this evening where there are gaps and there are things that Parliament itself is looking to improve upon. And we hope to identify some of those. We're going to be led by questions from the public. We're going to be very quick in answering them. And there's an opportunity over the next Tuesday, Wednesday this week to meet on the Evidence Week platform with your MP to discuss those issues further. We'll make that possible for you. But many constituency MPs are going to be joining us this evening to help you answer that and to make those conversations possible. You will be able to join also 15 research groups from around the UK who over Tuesday and Wednesday between 12 and 4 will be providing briefings and also researchers, specialists available to talk to MPs and their constituents about these issues. But tonight we have with us the chairs of select committees and committees in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords who are going to help to answer those questions. I'm delighted to be welcoming them. And I'll ask Greg Clark to introduce the work of the select committees. Greg Clark, MP and Chair of the Science and Technology Committee.
Tracy, thank you very much indeed. And to parliamentary colleagues, fellow panellists and to constituents, welcome. And thank you, Tracy, for organising this first virtual week to look at evidence in Parliament. As you say, I'm chair of the Science and Technology Select Committee, and many parliamentary colleagues, both in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, serve on select committees. And these select committees are really all about evidence. What we do is we take week by week evidence from witnesses, whether that's in person or written evidence. And many people on this call will have submitted evidence to select committees. So that's really important because it gives the chance to ask questions, to probe the evidence, especially on areas of policy relevance and topicality. The second thing is that we issue reports. These reports are advice, recommendations to government and sometimes other public bodies. And again, they're rooted in evidence. When committees come to write their reports, it's not just what happens to be bees in the bonnets of the members. We look at the evidence that we've taken, and all of the recommendations we make are in effect pointing to evidence that we've taken that we think the government should act on. So evidence is absolutely at the heart of what select committees do. It's great to have this week and this seminar now to be able to probe in a bit more detail into this. Certainly in science and technology, during the course of the pandemic, I think it's been evident that far more members of the public generally have had the chance to look at scientific evidence than perhaps has been the case for some years. And this is a good opportunity to build on that.
Thank you. And alongside you, there are also many others representing the committee. So I'm going to quickly run through, let everybody know who's here. If you could just raise your hands so that people following us on the live stream, it's live streaming out to YouTube, and also on the Evidence Week Brella site, which is where a lot of others from Parliament are following. We also have with us Darren Jones MP, the chair of the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee. Caroline Noakes MP, Chair of the Women and Equalities Committee, Philip Dunn MP, Chair of the Environmental Audit Committee, and Tom Twickenham MP, Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, will be joining us a bit later on this evening. We have with us also Baroness Lane Fox, Chair of the COVID-19 Committee, Baroness Armstrong, Chair of the Public Services Committee, and Lord Krebs, Chair of Food, Poverty, Health and Environment Committee. And to help them in answering the questions this evening, we have a panel of experts who provide evidence to Parliament and think about the evidence that Parliament needs. And before introducing all of them, I'm going to give a few words to Ed Humferson, Director General for Regulation at the UK Statistics Authority. I would be doing that. I think Ed is actually still trying to join us. I'm going to move to tell you who else is going to be joining us this evening from the experts. We also have Ian Diamond, the National Statistician, who is head of the Office for National Statistics. He will be joining us a little way through the evening as he comes from another appointment. We have also Ottoline Liza, who is the Director of UK Research and Innovation, joining us, and she is responsible for the government body, the government funded body, government funding that goes out to research institutions across the UK. We have Penny Young, the House of Commons librarian, and Dr. Chris Tyler, Director of Research at the UCL Department of Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy, and formerly himself Director of the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology. And I'm just checking to see whether Ed Humferson's with us this evening to be able to say a few words. I'm going to come back to him. We're going to move to our first question. Okay, do we have our first question? Do we have our first question?
Hi, yes, thank you for inviting me. I'd like to ask how the pandemic is affecting our progress towards the net zero carbon target and what's being done to make sure we're on track.
Okay, net zero carbon target. This is one, I think, for John Krebs.
Hi, thanks for the question, Emma. Obviously, achieving net zero is a huge challenge for the whole of society. Luckily, we have an independent body called the Climate Change Committee that was established under the Climate Change Act, and they advise the government on what needs to be done to get to net zero. And they published a report on building back better after the COVID epidemic. And their top priorities are as follows: better insulation of homes. Homes and buildings account for 18% of our greenhouse gas emissions. Improving transport, so to get people out of cars onto bikes or on foot or using public transport instead of cars. More low carbon electricity, maybe nuclear, it may be wind, it may be biofuels, more recycling and green manufacturing, and then last but not least, restoring the natural environment, planting trees, restoring peat bogs that are huge carbon stores. So there's a great mix of things that we need to get on with, and there's no time to waste because 2050 is not far away, and although we've done pretty well so far, it gets harder as you go along. So I hope that gives you a flavour.
Thank you. Your MP, Emma, is also on the line here, Munira Wilson, Twickenham. Munira.
Hi there. Would you like me to respond as well?
Yes, please.
Sorry. So we're aware that before the pandemic, that emissions of carbon dioxide were rising by about 1% every year, although plateaued last year largely with the expansion of renewable energy amid plummeting prices. And we know from the International Energy Agency that world use of energy has declined by 6% this year, which will obviously feed into falls in CO2 emissions. But researchers are warning that this won't result in any detectable climate effects in the long run. So we need to partner this with obviously longer term green stimulus measures to turn this sort of short-term decline in emissions into long-term emissions reductions in order to avoid the 0.3 degrees centigrade of warming by the mid-century, limiting it to 1.5 degrees. And I would just add that I understand that DEFRA, there was a recent DEFRA report that suggested there were quite a lot of gaps in evidence that need to be fulfilled. So I think working internationally to plug some of those research gaps, as well as working on that green recovery, hopefully we can stem that tide of emissions.
And I'm aware also that the BEIS committee looked into this in June, so perhaps we can come back to that. We can certainly post the link, Emma, to that from the BEIS, sorry, I didn't say called the BEIS committee, the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee, and we may be able to come back to that a bit later in the discussion. But I'm going to move now to Tom Clegg. You have a question from South Thanet. You have a question.
Hello, thank you. The government has proposed changes to EU fisheries policy, counteracting criticism from the policy during the Brexit process. What tools will Parliament use to monitor the effectiveness of these changes to ensure sustainable fisheries?
Thank you. Now, Craig McKinlay is your MP for South Thanet, and he was unable to join us this evening, but he has sent a comment in response to your question.
Yes, so Craig's response is as follows. Now that the United Kingdom has left the European Union, the Fisheries Bill will provide the legal framework for the UK to operate as an independent coastal state under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea after the transition period. The bill creates a common approach to fisheries management between the UK government and the devolved parliaments and makes reforms to fisheries management in England. The Select Committee for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, made up of a cross-party selection of MPs, will be on hand to monitor our post-Brexit fishing policy, as well as individual MPs and peers who will be able to table oral and written questions to ministers and hold debates on the UK fishing industry and associated policies.
Thank you. Philip Dunn, is this something that you are going to be looking at?
Well, I chair the Environmental Audit Committee, and we look right across government rather than shadowing a particular department. We tend to look at a lot of the work that DEFRA does because it has responsibility for a lot of environmental policy. But actually, fishing is not something that we specifically look at. What we did look at in the last Parliament was were two aspects which are related. One is the extraction of minerals from subsea resources, so trawling along the seabed. And we also looked at some of the environmental pollution caused by fish farms, in particular around the west coast of Scotland. So I can't say that we're necessarily going to look at what the impact of the Fisheries Bill will be, but we tangentially look at aspects of it.
Thank you. Maybe that is something that you could flag to consider whether anybody is looking at this in the future. Thank you, Tom, for your question. Lord Krebs, did you want to say a quick word on this at all from the Lord's side?
Thanks very much, Tracy. Yes, I would to you, Tom. I used to be on the EU Environment Committee in the Lords, and we did a lot of work on fisheries. The problem with most fisheries is that fishermen always want to take out more fish than they ought to because of short-term gain. So it's how do you trade off that sort of short-term urge to catch more fish with the long-term sustainability of the fish stocks. And in the EU Common Fisheries Policy, last year, only 60% of fish stocks were being fished at a sustainable level. Now, with our Fisheries Bill that we've already heard about, there is a chance for us to reset. But unfortunately, the government has refuse to make sustainability of the stocks in the short and long term the primary objective. So I'm worried that we're going to end up in exactly the same position as we have done under the Common Fisheries Policy, short-term gain for long-term pain. How do you actually check what's going on? The evidence is very clear. There's only one way of being absolutely sure what fishermen are taking out of the sea, and that's to have closed-circuit television on board every single fishing vessel. And the government has, after a lot of resistance, fortunately given way on that, and they're now launching a consultation to try and bring the fishermen along, the fishers along with them, to have CCTV installed on all fishing vessels. Once we've got that, we'll know exactly what's being taken out of the ocean, and hopefully we can manage things more sustainably.
So Tom, look out for that consultation. We have with us now Corrie from Help the Homeless in Leicester South. Corrie.
Hi. So our question is does Parliament consider how the measures it passes under the pandemic legislation affect homeless people and those in other non-standard living conditions?
Wow. We have John Ashworth, your MP, wanted to answer this, but he's unfortunately been tied up in meetings. Baroness Armstrong, is this one for you?
Our select committee, the Public Services Select Committee, has just had a look at the effect of COVID on public services. And in our report, which we published last week, we talk a little bit about the homeless. It's one of the aspects we talk about. I think that there has been a lot of concern about the homelessness, certainly in the Lords. And I was the minister who led the rough sleeping strategy between 1998 and 2001, when we reduced rough sleeping very significantly. The government was able to do that at the beginning of COVID by getting homeless people largely into hotels and other things, certainly in the north, in the area I come from in the northeast. We got them all into independent accommodation. But I don't think the truth is that the first lot of lockdown procedures were agreed without any discussion in either house. There has been more, and there has been more accountability for the second lockdown, but homelessness did not feature strongly in that. It's in other ways that Parliament has sought to address homelessness. And in our committee, we're very worried about the people who weren't part of the initial lockdown, because anybody, for example, without recourse to public funds, or anybody who became a rough sleeper after the lockdown, have much more difficulty in accessing services. And we think that that is a problem now, and the government also needs to take action, and I'm asking them to do this, on night shelters, because in London they are really dangerous.
Thank you. And that's an important point, of course, is that Parliament doesn't just look passively at things. Having investigated the evidence, parliamentarians actively pursue those questions with the government. Before I move to our next question, which comes from Jalisa Lynch, I wanted to introduce Ed Humferson, who's the Director General of for Regulation at the UK Statistics Authority, because there are a number of questions that I think he will be able to contribute on. Ed. Is Ed now with us?
Thanks very much, Tracy, and sorry for arriving late. Just wanted to say, firstly, I love Evidence Week. I love the way that you bring the public and Parliament and researchers together. Often you find things which are just two sides of that triangle. I think you bring all three sides together. What I do is I make sure that the evidence provided to the public meets really, really high standards. So any statistics published by government must meet our code of practice for statistics. And we think things like the COVID data on test and trace, or the infection survey by the ONS, all done to really, really high standards. And the same goes for all statistics produced by all government departments, must comply with those high standards. And I just think it's really important that we see that evidence being used as much as possible. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much, and sorry to be late.
Thank you. And we've had Jalisa Lynch, who's a teacher from Birmingham Edgbaston.
Hi, so my question, or it starts with a statement, although I'm sure you're all aware, teacher retention is low, with evidence suggesting that newly qualified teachers leave the profession in the first 5 years. So I was wondering, how is Parliament monitoring teacher health and satisfaction? And obviously this is particularly prevalent at the moment with the pandemic as well.
Right, does anybody want to answer that one? I'm not sure where that sits. Monitoring health and satisfaction and well-being is something I know that the Office of National Statistics does. Is anybody else able to say anything on this question? Caroline Noakes.
Sorry, and I'm just struggling to unmute myself. So I'm going to give this an apologies. This is a perspective from a very long time ago when I sat on the Education Select Committee, which I haven't done since about 2015-16. And it's a shame that Rob Halfon isn't with us tonight, because I know that this is an issue that would be much exercising his committee. Because when we look at the availability of teaching staff across all of our schools, it's absolutely imperative that we have the numbers of teachers, that we're attracting people into the profession, and of course, as you point out, retaining them whilst they're there. Now, I can't answer for Rob's committee as to what they're doing specifically to look at teacher retention and how well-being and satisfaction in the workplace is impacting that. But from a select committee chair's perspective, can say that that is absolutely the sort of thing that select committees can take evidence on, can speak to teaching professionals themselves. And certainly when I sat on that committee, it was an issue that we looked at closely.
Thank you, Karen. And actually, Rob Halfon from the Education Committee was very active in promoting Evidence Week. Was just unable to join us this evening, but I think we'll try and pick that. Jalisa, we will try and pick that question up with him over the next couple of days. We have a question that's come in from Laurie van Sommeren, who is unable to join us, but has asked us to put this question. And so I'm going to put it to Chris Tyler. Was any evidence provided by the government to Parliament prior to implementation of the COVID-19 lockdown in March 2020? We did still, he's from South East Cambridgeshire, we did still want to put that question because there were quite a number of other questions that people submitted along a similar line to this. Chris Tyler, is that something you can comment on?
Yeah, sure. It's been a really interesting thing as an academic, watching the flow of information from government scientists into both the public and the scrutiny domain of Parliament. It's safe to say that the flow of information from government was slow to start off with, but with respect to this particular question about the information that was provided prior to the lockdown, in one sense, it doesn't really matter, because Parliament handed over a bunch of decision-making powers to government in late March, and then promptly went into recess. And that meant that for the best period of about a month, there was very little, well, there was no parliamentary scrutiny from politicians of government decision-making. And I've got sort of two things to note along this line that have improved and hopefully can improve further. The first is that some countries, for example, New Zealand, established COVID committees that specifically looked at the strategic direction that the government should take, rather than the tactical responses to COVID. So, for example, in New Zealand, they appointed the leader of the opposition to that role. And it's important that such a committee exists in the House of Commons, because not only does it need to be strategic, but it also needs to be political and have political accountability and political responsibility. So that would have been a really nice thing to have happened early, and I don't think that it's too late. I think that it's very clear that the government still is struggling with some strategic issues relating to COVID. We haven't done a terribly good job at saving lives, and we haven't done a terribly good job saving the economy. And my experience of select committees is they are extremely effective at sharpening government thinking on these kinds of strategic issues. So that would be useful.
Okay, Chris, can I stop you there? Because on this point, sure. I want to come to Martha Lane Fox.
Thank you. Well, the House of Lords, as you know, is in a somewhat different position in terms of reviewing evidence, and I would agree with Chris about the process, and many members of the House of Lords are very well known for raising issues through the process of any kind of new legislation, either amendments back to government or trying to using votes to give the sense of their happiness or not with various directions. So, the House of Lords has taken all these lockdowns very seriously. I think the House of Lords has a somewhat different view and role, kind of thinking about the longer term. My own committee, the Select Committee on COVID-19, is considering kind of 2 to 5 years out. So we're not focused so much on what's happening right now, but we're trying to think about what's the impact of these long lockdowns and what will happen on a longer view, and we come to other ideas in the future. I think the House of Lords' role is somewhat different. It's can't stop anything, but it can certainly say, hold on a minute, have you thought about these different things in the future?
Thank you. We're going now to Jacqueline Geeky, who's a librarian from Gordon.
Hello, hi. What's your understanding of information literacy, and do you think it helps when reviewing evidence during the pandemic?
Okay, information literacy. I think this is one for Penny Young, the House of Commons librarian.
Hello. So it definitely helps when it comes to reviewing evidence at any point, and certainly during the pandemic. I think for me, whether we're talking about parliamentarians or we're talking about the public or we're talking about journalists or anybody that's trying to kind of understand and explain what's going on, it's about really the ability to draw conclusions, to evaluate sources, to understand data, to understand graphs, etc. So incredibly important. And I guess my one hope, if there's one upside of this whole ghastly kind of many months, it's that actually probably our information literacy generally has improved because we're also sort of desperate to understand what's going on. This is an opportunity as well to say, as much as anything, from a kind of supporting parliamentarians point of view, it's also about trusted sources. So the more that we can help in the Commons Library, we help MPs do their job, whether it's scrutinising legislation or representing the public. So our role, in a sense, is to make it easier for MPs and their staff to do their job. And if I just talk about the library a little bit, so a big thing that we do is we publish a lot of work. And whether that's about briefings, whether it's about topical issues, and we also support MPs in terms of if they've got particular inquiries in answering their questions. So we've been publishing a lot of work, and that's all available to you on commonslibrary.parliament.uk. So although it's aimed at our core customers, which, as I say, is MPs, we make it publicly available. And I think that's a really valuable thing to do. So if I just look at what we've done recently in terms of the pandemic, we've published work on the relationship between obesity and the COVID-19 outbreak, and we've also published something about the impact on cancer services. So we're doing very specific things and we're doing very big things. So as I say, information literacy is important, but it's also important to be able to access trusted sources.
Thank you. Jacqueline, that's a brilliant question. I know that Ed Humphreys from the Office of Statistics Regulation is also interested in this question, but I'm going to come back to him later in our discussion because there are other questions along a similar line. Your MP, Richard Thompson, is actually in the pension bill discussion on the floor of the House of Commons at the moment, but has, I know, sent you a detailed reply also on what he thinks about it. So I hope that that you've received that. Thank you for your question, Jacqueline. We move now to Errin Riley from Mind in Hackney North and Stoke Newington. Errin.
Thanks, Tracy. So mental health is a psychosocial issue that touches on the work of every government department, who often view data and evidence through their own lens. So I was just wondering, how does Parliament review where the government is missing the significant challenges and solution that could be provided?
Okay, so that's about cross-cutting work between government departments. I mean, I'm not sure how much parliamentarians can say about that, but reviewing whether government is looking at things in a cross-cutting way. I think it might be useful, actually. I mean, Greg Clark, your committee is a cross-cutting committee. So cross-cutting committees do have the capacity to look at whether we've got joined up government, don't they?
We do, Tracy. And so one of the things that my Science and Technology Select Committee is doing is teaming up with the Health and Social Care Select Committee. We've got a joint inquiry recognising exactly that COVID doesn't fall into departmental silos. So that gives us the ability to pool our resources, and certainly the impact on other parts of health, i.e. sort of non-direct COVID-related health is very much in mind.
Okay.
Perhaps, Tracy, just to kind of refer back to one of the questions about whether there was evidence provided to Parliament at the time of the initial lockdown. Well, Baroness Armstrong was absolutely right that, of course, the initial lockdown came very quickly, necessarily so, and so there wasn't the opportunity to do that. But the select committees all met virtually throughout the whole pandemic, including over Easter, and we considered, for example, we had a meeting, the Science and Technology Committee, in mid-March, in which we heard from Sir Patrick Vallance, from Chris Whitty, from Neil Ferguson, from Sharon Peacock of Public Health England. And that proved to be quite an important meeting. One of the things that it raised was that we didn't seem to be following the testing approach that some countries like South Korea had. So we were able to scrutinise. And one of the things that we did was to ask for the publication of the members of SAGE and its minutes and the papers that they were considering, which were secret until that point. And I'm pleased to say, and it's one of the outcomes of, I think, good scrutiny, that was disclosed and is now published regularly.
Thank you. We're going to come on. There's a question about that, I think, coming up. Yeah, so I'm going to move now actually to the next question. I know there are other comments that people would like to make on some of these. Errin, I think your question is perhaps also something maybe that affects research as well, in terms of understanding the cross-cutting nature of that issue, because I think you were asking beyond COVID about that. I don't know, Otin and Jalisa, whether you wanted to say anything about support for research that cuts across different areas of research that might support decision making, or we can come back to that later in the discussion.
Yeah, so I think this is a really important question, because so many of the things that we're interested in are indeed cutting right across government departments. So the discussion about net zero earlier, for example, this is an area where this is not a single departmental issue. And so the UK Research and Innovation is an arm's length body associated with BEIS, but we work very closely with colleagues from right across government. And of particular value from that point of view is the network of chief scientific advisors. So each department has a scientific advisor, and they work closely together to share information across departments and to identify areas where that cross-departmental collaboration is important. And we work very closely with them to understand how we can invest research and innovation funding in a way that supports the research needs of government departments. And each department publishes areas of research interest, which also help to inform those kinds of decisions. So it's difficult because of the way Parliament and government works, but we are working hard to do that join up, which is so important.
Thank you. Charlie Condras, who's a graphic designer from Sheffield Central, your question, please. Charlie, you're on mute. You're on mute, Charlie.
Oh, sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Wonderful. I can understand the problem with a bunch of strangers in a small, sweaty, unventilated room. And I was just wondering, what evidence does Parliament use to decide if it's safe to start playing live music again?
Okay, that sounds like a question that might be close to your heart. Can I ask that to Darren Jones?
Well, thanks for that question, and it's very timely because tomorrow morning we have representatives from UK hospitality, retail and the events industry, as well as Excluded UK and others appearing before the Business Committee to talk about this very issue. Where there's an overlap between economic policy and health policy, we have to be very conscious, though. It's not for the BEIS Committee to decide what we think would be the public health triggers at which it would be appropriate for those events and those industries to start to reopen. But what we can do is feed through ideas from the industry and those sectors about how they can work in a COVID secure way, but also understand the economic costs of the lockdown and what support might be helpful to them to ensure that they survive through the lockdown and start to thrive as part of our economic recovery in the new year. So we would rely on other committees and indeed the public health experts to take the decision on the public health aspects, but we would consider the economic aspects.
Right. And you're scrutinising the evidence that's being used to take those decisions.
Exactly, yeah. So we'll be briefed in the same way as other committees, both in terms of written evidence and witnesses before our panels to give us their opinion on that.
Right, great. Charlie, I should point out to you that you are able to watch the evidence that parliamentary committees take. You're able to actually look at people giving their evidence orally. And if you want some help with that, then we'd be happy to put you in touch through the Evidence Week channel over the next few days. Thank you, Darren. We're moving now to two questions. I'm going to take them one after the other because they're pretty similar, and it brings us back to the discussion we just had about literacy. I'm going to take James Williams from Brighton Pavilion and Shama Rattan-Booth from Henley. James.
Thank you very much. I've got a fairly simple question, really. It's to ask the panel that in the light of the proliferation of fake news and anti-vaccination misinformation, how does Parliament monitor and measure scientific literacy in the population? And by scientific literacy, I mean the nature of science, scientific logic, and the nature of scientific evidence, as opposed to science knowledge, i.e. knowing the facts of science. And what evidence do you actually use for that?
Wow, that's a challenging question. Shama Rattan-Booth, do you want to ask something on a similar point here?
Yes, thank you, Tracy. My question is, with the rise of misinformation online, how much responsibility should MPs and the government have towards actively seeking evidence and calling out these false claims?
Okay, Ed Humpherson, is information literacy in the population something that you
I think it's important. Actually, I agree with what Penny Young said earlier, that I think this pandemic has shown us that people are really happy and willing to engage with evidence and data when it's something that really relates to their lives. And the way that we look at it as a regulator of government statistics is often that to focus on the information literacy in the population sort of puts quite a lot of onus on the public, and maybe the problem arises elsewhere with the quality with which information is actually communicated. So we should focus as much on how government and other experts present information in a way that's accessible, that explains what it means, it's clear, put the onus on there rather than on saying, well, one of our problems is levels of information literacy. As I say, what the pandemic shows us is people are able to engage. Having said that, there will be times when people misuse evidence and misstate evidence. And I think it's really important that there are organisations like mine which are willing to step in and clarify what the correct interpretation is. And I think we do need to play that role confidently and firmly.
Right, John Howell MP, you are the MP for Henley, so you are Shama's MP. Is this concern about that both of our questions have had about people's ability to sift information, to work out false claims and so on? Is that something that you've been thinking about in relation to your constituents?
Yes, it is, and I think one of the things to avoid in all of this is becoming wedded to social media. I mean, social media has a useful place. But in terms of spreading myths and of running absurd conspiracy theories, you haven't seen anything like those that are running on social media. Now, the point for an MP is to make sure that you go for trusted sources, and you don't just rely on things that come up ad hoc, as it were. And of course, one of the most trusted sources is the House of Commons Library. Because that provides a huge amount of. I see Penny is signalling approval for that, but it is one of the most trusted sources, and it provides that objective and independent of party view of things that I think we are all important. And the other thing that I would just mention there is the work of select committees, because the work that we get on the select committees, the briefings that we get on select committees, and the questions that we get on select committees move as far away from misrepresentation as it is possible to get. And for those that haven't looked at them, I really would advise looking at them to see how we try to get the objective information from those that are coming to give evidence to the select committees.
Okay, thank you. Chris Tyler, just 10 seconds left on this question. Did you have something to say about the responsibility that MPs have to check out?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, leadership in this issue is a really important thing for politicians to take on. And I think that compared to other countries, our politicians can be really proud of the job they've done. But they wouldn't be able to do it without the outstanding support that are provided to them from places like the House of Commons Library, the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, the House of Lords Library, select committee staff. They've just worked tirelessly to get evidence to politicians when they've needed it most.
Thank you. I'm sure they appreciate that, and that's certainly something that we would echo. And thank you, John Howell. It sounds Shama, John, meet each other, because it sounds as though there's something there that you could usefully discuss a bit further in terms of whether we're really having equipping constituents to sift these things, and how better we can do that, particularly with social media. We're moving now to Abdullah Iqbal from Pendle, who has rather a different question. I believe Andrew Stevenson, your MP, is also joining us on the line. Abdullah Iqbal.
Hi. With the proportion of elderly people rising in Pendle, and as older populations typically suffer more from mental health illnesses and brain diseases, how are you assessing the interventions and programs that can be put in place to tackle this problem?
Do you mean more generally, or in relation to the COVID crisis?
I mean more generally.
More generally, yeah, because it's a problem in Pendle. Okay. So the services. Hilary Armstrong, is this something we can come to you on with public services?
Okay, I don't think that this is something that Parliament has been looking at. There has been in the House of Lords a special select committee that looked at ageing and at what should be done, and they would draw on a lot of support there. But one of the things I wanted to say was that I think we need to look much more in this country at what are called evidence-based programs, where there is a real research and program linked together and tested out over the years, so that you really then find out what works best and what are the elements that you need to do regularly to actually make sure that it really does work for the people that you need it to work for. I've looked at that particularly in early years, and did introduce a program called the Nurse Family Partnership, which was seen to be the most effective in the world, actually, at reducing harm and at improving the performance of young children. We're very bad at doing it here, because we always think we can find something new and that we're special. And so we shouldn't be relying on the evidence. But in other parts of the world, they very much rely on some evidence-based programs.
Thank you.
And we went around the world looking for them. And I think that this is an area where we really should investigate more. And I'm hoping we're going to have a look at that in our committee.
Thank you. And not only Liza, support, there is research funding support for the kind of what works question, isn't there?
Absolutely. There's the whole network of what works centres, and the kinds of study that you were just describing. There are quite a lot of quite well-established cohort studies that are following groups of people across the years, and are then able to identify correlates with good and bad outcomes, and those then can form the basis for designing interventions to test whether those correlations have some causative basis. So these things take time, but there are indeed systems in place to try to build that evidence base that we need for the kinds of interventions we're going to have to develop to support an ageing population.
Thank you. Andrew Stevenson, you're Abdullah's MP. Is this the kind of research that can help support the concerns of people in Pendle?
Definitely, and I think this is a great question from Abdullah. This is something we've got to focus on as a country. I can see Greg Clark is on the line, and when I was briefly a Bays minister last year, Bays had identified the ageing population as one of the kind of grand challenges facing the country, where research investment needed to be made. So I'm pleased to see investments been made at that kind of national level in this. I think a doubling of research funding. But more importantly, I think it's about awareness. And I, like many other MPs, have done the Alzheimer's Society's training to become a dementia friend. So we've all got a role to play. But hopefully what we're seeing with COVID and some of the scientific breakthroughs on vaccines show that actually with enough resources and dedicated focus and research, we really can solve some of the big challenges and some of the unsolvable questions. So hopefully that gives us some good hope going forward that we can look after our loved ones even better. My own grandmother suffered with vascular dementia for many years before dying.
Thank you. There was a lot there in response to that question, Abdullah. I think there are other things that people would want to say, so I'm sure that we're going to be pursuing that over the next couple of days, and we'll keep you in that discussion. Claire Price from Merthyr Tydfil and Rumney, you have a question, and your MP Gerald Jones is also with us.
Thank you. My question is, can MPs measure whether science communicators would aid effective communication of evidence to the general public?
Okay. Right, so this is about actually understanding whether there's really a professional enough conversation going on between research and Parliament and the public. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, Gerald Jones, did you want to say something about this?
Yes, certainly. First of all, obviously, thanks to Claire for asking that question. It's hugely important, and I think hugely timely as well, given where we are with the pandemic. And I think there is an issue. Looking at the results of the Ipsos Mori poll in the summer about the lack of trust in the message from government, I think we do have to find different ways of getting that communication across. Clearly, we can't replace the government getting their message out, but I think it's important that we have alternative ways as well. And certainly the science communicators, I think, is a really interesting idea. We've seen the success in a number of areas, and I think to find a different, effective and engaging way of getting the message across may help in particularly in the pandemic, but post-pandemic as well, to get messages across to the public, because I think the evidence is there, but I think it's how we communicate that to a wider audience, which I think at the moment it is getting lost, because there are people who don't trust, perhaps because of the messenger rather than the message. So I think there is an important role there as well.
Right, Claire, your MP is very much on your side there. Penny Young from the House of Commons Library, do you have a perspective on this?
Well, just to add, I mean, nobody's ever going to argue against science communicators, I think, and I think they've really got their role, but I think we probably do have to understand it in the wider ecosystem, again, of sort of trusted communicators, and as we've sort of talked about, trusted sources and trusted brands. And ultimately, any individual needs a range of people that they do trust, whether it's really good journalists who know their stuff and have got an engaging style, some of the brands like Full Fact, Reality Check. And often these groups of people, or kind of trusted brands, if you like, are drawing on trusted sources like the House of Commons Library, even though, again, it's not our main purpose. It's good that a wider range of outfits are drawing on us. I think the really difficult thing, though, at the end of the day, and I have no idea what the answer is to this question, is ultimately, unless the public really care, and the public is too sweeping a statement, it's about different groups within the public, really kind of care either about what the true answer is, or when it's wider policy questions, that to care as much about the means in a sense as the ends. That's where the difficulty lies. I think that's kind of the really difficult, back to the misinformation and disinformation question. If people really believe something to be true and don't really want to countenance a different opinion or a different reality, that's where the difficulty lies, I think. And I think we've got to do a lot more work collectively to really understand how we get people to care about what the truth is, although obviously that's a contested concept.
It's a lot more about putting a professional angle on it. Tomorrow and Wednesday, the Institute of Development Studies is actually running a 3-minute rapid briefing on some cutting-edge research around community engagement, trust building, and tackling misinformation, very much in the pandemic context. But they're going to be running that. That's for MPs and for constituents to join them if they want to. So I really do advocate going along to that. It's research is on hand as well. We're moving, thank you, Claire. We're moving now to Lisa Riviera from Cambridge. Your question, please.
Hi, thanks, Tracy. So my question is, research into the effects of the microbiome in human, animal, and crop health is a very promising field. With the UK reclaiming responsibility for food regulation after January 1st, how will Parliament monitor progress in this field?
Okay, Darren Jones, is this something that you're looking at in relation to business practice? We have Darren with us. We seem to have
Sorry, Tracy. Darren Jones had to step out. He has another event to get to, but he sends us with a card. So thanks for a good event.
Thank you. That's fine. Thank you. John Krebs, could we ask you on this? Lord Krebs.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. And Lisa, thanks for the question. I think very simply, the answer is that in terms of process, the Food Standards Agency will have responsibility for monitoring research on the microbiome, particularly in relation to food safety. But of course, there is research suggesting that it could have implication for a whole range of conditions like obesity and other health issues. So I think in terms of understanding the science of it, which would be something that Ottilie would probably be able to comment on, that'll be the responsibility of UKRI. But in terms of the regulation, it'll be primarily the Food Standards Agency.
Thank you.
And they'll base their regulatory decisions on advice from expert panels of scientists.
Thank you. Before I go, I'm just going to give Ottilie a word on that in a moment. But Philip Dunn, also environmental audit. This is something obviously of concern to you, isn't it? Effectively, we're looking at the change in regulation.
I think the government is going to be focusing through the Environment Bill on soil quality, water quality, air quality, and food production using new technology. There's a huge shift likely to happen in land use, which is something that we are looking at on our committee, and how that shakes down as the population grows and we are going to have to feed a significantly larger population across the world from a smaller landmass. The only way we're going to do that is by adopting technology, and that will come in the form of improved plant health and resistance to disease, some element of gene editing to allow plants to grow and survive in a way that they can't at the moment. And some of this is going to be controversial, but if we don't do it, we're going to have large numbers of people around the world in places where they don't have a temperate climate like we do, unable to eat. So I think that this is all tied up with a major issue which we'd face globally on how do we constrain the growth in the human population on this planet. And I don't think any politicians are really addressing that issue, certainly not in this country at the moment.
Thank you. Ottilie, did you want to say something very brief on this?
On microbiomes, absolutely. It's a very active area of research. So it's one of the exciting new fields that has emerged really from the fact that we now can access the sequence of the DNA of organisms much more easily. And so that's allowed us to develop a field that's called metagenomics, where you can just sequence all the DNA in a load of soil or in your gut and discover a lot by analysing that about the populations of bacteria that are living in the soil or your gut or whatever. And that has really sparked a whole set of experiments to understand what the contribution those bacteria are, both in your gut and in the soil, to human health, to plant health, and so on. And so understanding that, I think, will be really important in all kinds of health contexts, because those bacteria make a major contribution to metabolism in your body, and also in the soil to the whole story of plant health and a variety of sustainability issues. So it's a very exciting area for research.
And helping Parliament to follow that research, of course, will be another focus of those researchers, I'm sure. Naima Begum, you've joined us from Solihull. Would you like to ask your question? Naima? Naima, you're on mute. Do you want to? Okay. Hello, you're on mute, Naima. You need to unmute yourself.
Hello.
Hello.
Oh, sorry. Basically, my question is, how does Parliament monitor the work around STEM for the older people and the BAME community and disabled communities? And do they use the data to help these communities in future initiatives?
Okay, thank you. So how does Parliament monitor? So I just say STEM is science, technology, engineering and medicine for those people who don't follow that language. Would anybody like to answer that question? Greg Clark, is this one for you?
Sure, Tracy. I think Caroline Noakes from the Equalities Committee was going to come in as well. But it is so we know that the opportunities that are available are increasing in the STEM fields, but it still has proven difficult for people to break into, especially from BAME backgrounds, and there's still underrepresentation of women here. So on our committee, one of the things that we're going to be doing over the next year is to look at how we can establish ways to make it easier for people from a broader variety of backgrounds, not only to come in, but to prosper in STEM.
Thank you.
But Caroline may want to add.
Yeah, Caroline, sorry, I should have come to you.
Thanks, Tracy. And it's from the perspective of the Women and Equalities Committee, of course, these are areas that we're really concerned about, because it's not just about STEM, but it's about opportunity across the board. And I know Greg and I recently had a really interesting meeting about opportunities for research funding for women, which is a particular problem, but the same applies also to BAME communities and also to the disabled. And I think it's really challenging that Parliament has to cover so many issues all at one hit. I'm very conscious that my committee has spent the last 6 months now pretty much talking about nothing but the reality is that as we move forward to the post-pandemic time, we will continue to look about opportunities, about levelling up and making sure, and from my perspective, it's really crucially important, making sure that they're available to everyone. And when we're talking about levelling up, we don't get sort of focused too much on the geography of levelling up, but we look across communities as well.
Thank you, Caroline. We've been joined by the National Statistician, Ian Diamond, and I know that ONS, the Office for National Statistics, does look at participation in a range of different workforces and a range of different sectors. Ian, is this something that you can help with?
Thank you. Yes, things are incredibly important because I'm strongly of the view that without really good and accurate data, we cannot know the extent of the challenges. And yes, there are, without question, challenges that we have to address. And that's why we at the ONS have set up an inclusive data task force chaired by Dame Moira Gibb, which will, over the next couple of months, be looking at all aspects of the collection and analysis of data associated with inclusivity. And we will be looking to take on board any recommendations from that task force and to publish widely analyses which will inform policy. And I hope very much that the committees of Caroline Noakes and Greg Clark will be interested in those results. Thank you.
Thank you, that's very useful. And we move now to George Hind, who's also Brighton Pavilion. Second question from there today. George.
Thank you, Tracy. So, as it stands, obtaining a gender recognition certificate.
George, your microphone seems a bit low. Are you able to get a bit closer to it?
Yes, I'll try. Can you hear me now?
Just about.
Okay. So as it stands, obtaining a gender recognition certificate requires medical consultation. This is an intensive process and only supports binary genders. How does Parliament measure the mental health impact of this policy?
Okay, Caroline, that's another one for you.
It is indeed, and thank you very much for that question, George. So you'll be conscious that a few weeks ago, the Secretary of State for Women and Equality announced that they were going to make the process kinder and simpler. And from my committee's perspective, that is not good enough to come out with those generalities. We want the specifics of it. So we launched an inquiry into the Gender Recognition Act and the proposals that come out of the government. You'll be aware that there was a consultation in 2018 it's only 2020 that we've seen the outcome of that. So from our view, that's not good enough, a 2-year delay. But what we want to hear, and the call for evidence is open until the 27th of this month, is that we want to hear from people their views on how the process should be made simpler, whether they're satisfied with what the government is doing on this. Provide us with the evidence. We'll then hold hearings. We'll invite people in to talk to us and give us their view. And from there, we'll make recommendations to government as to how the select committee thinks that they should proceed.
Thank you. I think we will try to share some of that. If you can provide that, Caroline. George, we'll try to share some of that and put it up on the Evidence Week platform. You can continue that conversation and also to share how people can contribute to that inquiry when it comes along, where to look. People don't necessarily know how to look for daily parliamentary bulletins and that kind of thing. And I think we can take that opportunity to share them. We're coming now to Sarah Jane Ambler, who's a midwife from Raynham. Sarah.
Hi Tracy. I just wanted to ask if there are any plans to explore the impacts of lockdown, both positive and negative, upon community behaviour.
Positive and negative impacts.
Yeah.
Okay. Your MP, Christy Raymond, was unable to join us. I know wanted to. Others I know want to comment on this. Baroness Armstrong. Baroness, okay. Otterlyn, Liza, you also wanted to comment on this.
Not that I know of.
But, sorry. Okay. I think research into communities. I think was something.
I mean, certainly we have a lot of ongoing programs looking at the social science impacts of COVID, but I'm not aware of specific programs on that I could use to illustrate the point. Ian Diamond has his hand very helpfully up there.
Okay, Ian Diamond, who's the National.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's a really good question, and what we at the Office for National Statistics are doing is we have a number of ways of looking at both social and biomedical impacts, and we run a weekly survey which is looking and has been running since March, which looks at the experiences of people during the restrictions. And we have found, for example, that people with a disability are much more likely to feel anxious, are much more likely to feel that their mental health has been negatively impacted. And we look very carefully at that and link it to the work that we do on measuring the incidence of the pandemic, and also some of the work that we do on looking at local economic impacts. All these are brought together, and the most recent piece, which is a piece on the impact of the Tier 3, Tier 2, Tier 1, will be available later this week on our website. Thank you.
Okay, I've just seen that that's been shared on the chat there as well.
Sarah, can I come in, Tracy, very quickly? I'm really sorry, I got my mute and unmute confused there. We looked at particularly the effect on a range of group of people, and we had some organisations do some focus group work with the elderly, with people with complex needs, with the homeless, and with other groups as part of our inquiry. And I think it's now very important that Parliament listens directly to the voice of people we now call with lived experience. And we've used an organisation that the House of Lords has set up called the Engagement Team to work with charities and other organisations outside of Parliament to directly connect with people with lived experience and for them to feed into our knowledge and understanding. So it's not as scientific as Ian Diamond is doing at the ONS in terms of number crunching, but it is listening and directly reflecting the views of the people who've been affected, both positive and negative.
Thank you. And Sarah, that was Baroness Armstrong, who is chair of the Public Services Committee. We move to Bruce Taylor, who is an allotment holder in Aberdeen South. Bruce. Bruce, you're on mute. I can see you're there, but you're on mute. Bruce. Okay. Hello, Bruce. If you click the little microphone, you'll come off mute. Okay, I'm going to come back to that. We have a question from Maria Booker, who is trying to serve her. Oh, is that? Who is that? Okay, so Maria has recorded her question because she had to rush off and serve her family tea. I have no audio for this, so. Sophie, I'm not getting audio for this. Okay. Okay, I think we'll stop the video and I'm going to read her question because I've just seen it come through. Okay, I've just seen Maria's question come through. She said, has the government used evidence from previous epidemics in the handling of coronavirus? Right, so this is, we've just actually been joined by Tom Twickenham, who is chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Tom, can I come to you first just to ask whether the government is using evidence internationally and how well? That would be quite interesting, I think.
So this is something that we're trying to get the government to do, which is to compare our performance with those of others. Some performances are pretty stark. So if you look at, for example, Taiwan or New Zealand, it appears that we've done significantly worse. But of course, the challenge there is, are we comparing like with like? And the reality is, of course, no. Now, I know Greg Clark's done some work on this on the Science Committee on actual, the various ways in which it's been looked at. And what we've been doing from the Foreign Affairs Committee is asking the government to find comparators and see what's realistic. And the real comparators are, of course, mostly European, because if you look at countries that have done well, for example, like Pakistan, you may say, well, it's a comparator in the sense that it's not isolated and therefore it's got a lot of throughput of migration. That's true, but it also has a much younger demographic and it has a very different social setup. So you find yourself very quickly coming down to looking at comparisons in sort of Northwestern Europe, really. And there we are drawing lessons, but not as many as we should. I mean, it's quite noticeable that some of the worst affected areas in the UK are, in some of the devolved regions, and they compare on occasion very poorly with neighbouring states or indeed with other European countries. And the UK itself compares, depending on where you look, better or worse than somewhere like France.
Okay, thank you. Ottilie Liza from the UK Research and Innovation. Is there a comment on this one?
So as I understood it, the question was about whether we'd used data from previous epidemics, not from current pandemics in different countries. And indeed, a lot of the work feeding into SAGE, for example, has been groups who are expert in epidemiology who absolutely have used their previous experience of effective modelling of disease to try to understand the spread of coronavirus. And of course, the difficulty with a lot of these models is they're very dependent on understanding key things about your specific virus to do with, how long it takes symptoms to develop, what proportion of people who have the virus get symptoms and so on and so forth, and how transmissible it is. And so it's quite difficult to do those direct comparisons, but nonetheless, the approaches that we know are effective have certainly been transferred from previous understandings of disease spread and epidemiology to this situation.
Thank you. We now have Bruce Taylor, the allotment holder from Aberdeen South, who is able to join us.
Thank you, Tracy. Sorry about that little technical hitch. The UK will need to grow more of its own food, and the physical mental health was big issues before the COVID-19. How can Parliament measure the health and environmental benefits of allotments compared to other uses of land?
Wow, that's a tough question. Thank you very much. I'm glad you did come on and say that, Bruce. I know ONS has data on provisioning services of allotments in urban areas. Is that something, Ian, you want to comment on?
We've certainly got data on green areas, access to green areas, and access to allotments and ownership of allotments. And those we publish, I would have to say that it seems to me it would be possible to design an experiment which looked at the impact of allotment holding on all kinds of well-being, but I am unaware that that experiment has been designed, but others may have more knowledge than I.
Okay, Penny Young, you have constituency data dashboards. Is this the kind of thing that fits with the data you hold on constituencies?
To my knowledge, I'm not sure that we have one on allotments, but it's probably only a matter of time. But no, you're right that we do. One of our big innovations over the last few years has been to take respected data, a lot of it actually from the Office of National Statistics, and basically curate that at a local level so that, again, it's there for MPs and staff, but it's also available to the public, which may be about broadband availability, it may be about different types of health, a kind of whole wide range of statistics that you can interrogate and download the data at a constituency level. So an incredibly useful tool for MPs and constituents, but I don't think we've got one on allotments.
Okay, well, Bruce, when MPs start to get that data, and I think it sounds like you should be agitating for that, we'll all know that we heard it here first, and you said it directly to the House of Commons librarian. So do please pursue that question. Max Kidd is a software developer from Morecambe and Lunesdale. Unfortunately, your MP David Morris wanted to join us, but can't. But Max Kidd.
Hi, thanks, Tracy. We are able to get we are able to view the statistics of COVID cases at a local authority level. However, deaths are limited to a regional level and testing is at a national level. What was the reasoning behind this?
Okay, I don't know that we still have, do we still have Martha Lane Fox with us? We don't have Martha Lane Fox with us at the moment. Greg Clark, is this something you can comment on before I go to Ian Diamond?
Well, I was going to say, I think Sir Ian Diamond is probably best placed on that. My understanding is that we do have tests on a local basis as well, but perhaps Sir Ian should answer. Okay, Ian Diamond.
Yeah, thank you. No, we can now get tests down to a local area, and indeed the work I reported earlier about the impact of tiers 3, 2 and 1 in England was done on local authority data. The point I would make on testing that I think is worthwhile is that, of course, the tests only reflect the positive tests. There are many asymptomatic people who will not be tested. So if you see the number of tests, the number of people with the virus is actually more than double that. So I think it's an important point to remember. But we do have those data now down to local authority level, and I hope that the Joint Biosecurity Centre will be publishing that. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, we now have a question.
Just on that, Tracy, just draw attention to it. The dashboards that's on the gov.uk site has a lot of information, testing, deaths, hospital admissions, all with a drop-down menu for local authorities. So if you haven't, if anyone on the call is interested in this, hasn't seen it for a while, do look on that because it's got a ton of evidence.
It really is a very good dashboard. Thanks for raising that, Greg.
Thank you. Okay, we'll be sharing that dashboard in the chat if we can. I don't know if that's something that chat if we can. I don't know if that's something that someone can put up there while we're on. Linda Forbes from Milton Keynes South. Is Linda with us?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Tracy. My question is regarding artificial intelligence and disaggregation of data sets, particularly regarding gender. So how does Parliament review gender biases in government interventions based on AI?
Okay. Linda, have you got a particular AI intervention in your mind when you say that question?
It was particularly around domestic abuse and the development of apps to identify people who are most at risk, but also more generally as well in terms of prison populations.
Okay, thank you. Caroline Noakes, I think this is for you.
Thank you. I think that's an absolutely excellent question, particularly when it comes to domestic abuse, because we very sadly know that whilst the vast majority
Caroline, your sound keeps coming in and out. I don't know if you can move your microphone. Is that
there? Is that better?
It keeps fading in and out, and I don't know why. It does sound clear.
No, I'm sorry. I had this problem in the chamber earlier today when trying to ask a question of the Leader of the House. It's broadband in the sticks, not being
right.
Are you getting any of it?
Yeah, some of it. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for the question, Linda. I think it's a really important one, and we know that domestic abuse impacts women in the majority, but also increasing numbers of male victims. And we also know that transgender and non-binary people are the most likely to be victims. However, what I can't answer to you is how the government is collecting data and using data around that. My committee scrutinises the work of the Government Equalities Office, and that is certainly an issue that I'm very happy to take away and raise with them to ascertain what they're using the data, or how they're using the data and where they're collecting it from. As a former minister for the Government Digital Service, I am happy to comment a little bit on AI, because I was very struck as the minister there that GDS was almost exclusively staffed by men. They were almost exclusively white men, and they were the people who were writing the algorithms for an enormous amount of the programs that the government is reliant upon. And so I think these are really serious issues. And although that's not within my remit at the moment, the GDS, I think it's something that we need to be conscious of the whole time.
Linda, it sounds like Parliament's on your side, at least, in asking that question. Julian Hitchcock from South West Norfolk, you're taking us in a different direction here, I think.
Hello, yes, good evening. Yes, I should say I'm a life science lawyer, so my real question is actually about, which is about relative risk, is really about one particular policy issue. And it's one which arises a lot, I think, in that context. But I'd particularly be interested in getting a handle on how parliamentarians and ministers measure relative risk when deciding matters of policy. So it's a very open question.
I'm going to stop you there because we have to be really brief. We've got so many more questions, Julian. Do you measure relative risk? John Krebs, can I put that one to you?
Yeah, thanks very much, Tracy, and thanks very much for the question. I'll give you a concrete example. I used to be the head of the Food Standards Agency, and we did a lot of work on how people perceive the relative risk from food. And when you ask people, they think the risks are things like pesticide residues on food, allergens, maybe GMOs. But what they completely don't recognize, actually, the really big risks in the food you eat are the things that impact on your likelihood of suffering from heart disease or other chronic diseases such as cancer. So they're things like salt, saturated fat, and so on. So what I'm saying here is there's often a gulf between the scientific assessment of the facts of risk from evidence, how many people die per year or whatever your evidence is, and the public perception of risk. And I think when politicians are dealing with risk and regulation, they have to factor in both. So in transport safety, for example, trains are much safer than roads, but there's far more outcry if there's a train accident than if there's a road accident. And therefore more money is spent on making trains safe than on making roads safe because of public perception rather than scientific evidence.
Okay, and this is also a question for MPs, isn't it? The question was how MPs understand relative risk. I think all those issues are probably things that need to be addressed inside the House as well as out. Mike Dalgleish sent a question from Oxford, West and Abingdon. I do want to raise it very briefly to Ed Humphreys for just a 20-second reply, because it's an important question. And then we'll be moving on to Dave Bates, who's joined us from Strood. So Mike Dalgleish's question is, in the context of COVID-19 and SAGE, for what reasons is all information, including algorithms and program code, not made publicly available when it's part of the government's decision making? Ed Humphreys, do you have a view on making algorithms and program code available?
Well, yes, we do. And basically our default view is make as much available as possible. And in fact, we've probably seen during the pandemic, we've stepped in quite a few times to say more information should be made available, where it's being referred to publicly or it's being used to support some really major decisions which have impacts on people's lives, make the information available. So we think the default should be to publish. Of course, government itself has a huge amount of data at any given time, and we're not from a second arguing that everything should be just dumped on the public, but where something is really material and it's being used to inform these really major decisions, we think the default should be to make it as available as possible. And in general, the good news is the government is really adhering to that, and particularly in the last couple of months has really tried to do that much more than it did right at the start.
Thank you. Actually, I'm sorry, I've got someone before Dave Bates. I got Balraj Singh Samrai, who's a musician from Manchester Central. So I'm going to take your question because you've been waiting a while, Balraj, and then I'll move to Dave Bates. Balraj.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. My question is, there's not been enough emphasis placed on the systemic issues around why people who've experienced racism, such as those from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, were affected by COVID-19, affected by the pandemic more so. Is Parliament looking into this?
Is Parliament looking into this? Caroline Notes.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. And the Women and Equality Select Committee, right at the beginning of the pandemic, launched an inquiry into the unequal impact of COVID. Because of the wealth of information evidence we received, we then split that into 3 separate inquiries: the gendered economic impact of COVID, the impact on people with disabilities, and the disproportionate impact on Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities.
Caroline, your sound is really dropping now. Can I ask you to share with us that on the
chat? No
yeah,
problem.
Thank you very much. Thank you. But I would like to just briefly take Ottoline Liza on this, on the research side, because obviously there's a lot of research going on in this area, isn't there?
Absolutely, we have run specific calls on this area. The first one largely focused on the medical correlates, and the second one, which is still open, so I think, it's more focused on the wider systemic issues, as you were talking about in sociological issues. So we are absolutely determined to contribute high quality evidence to the discussion about why there is this disparity.
Thank you. Dave Bates, who runs a kitchen company in Rochester and Strood. Dave, you need to click unmute. You need to click unmute. Click the microphone button at the bottom left of your screen.
I've got it.
Yeah, you're there. You're there. And go close to your phone so that we can hear you.
Can you hear me all
right? Close to your phone is better.
Right, it's my computer. All right, how's that?
Just about.
Cool. I'll speak loud. Okay. My question would be, what evidence does Parliament use to look at the effects of COVID-19, or what the effects are that they've had on small businesses, and just as importantly, if not more so, how it affects the lives and mental health of the people behind those businesses?
Right, okay, there's 2 big questions there. So on small businesses, I think, Darren Jones had to leave us, unfortunately, actually. We could come back to him. Greg Clark.
Sure. Well, as you imply, Tracy, Darren Jones, who chairs the Business Committee, is looking at a lot of this. But on the Science and Technology Committee, we've had a lot of discussions around this. And what I would say is, in terms of the the kind of the pure science, the kind of medical science, and some of the statistical and epidemiological aspects, we've had a lot of publication of evidence that's been considered, the impact in terms of different groups of the population. Our view as a committee was that we haven't had the same transparency about the economic impact, including the impact on businesses. And so this is one of the points that our committee has made, that we'd like to see that catch up with the degree of what I might say the kind of the pure science aspect of it.
Right, thank you. That was Greg Clark, MP. Dave, Ian Diamond is the national statistician. Ian, Office for National
Tracy, yeah, thank you very much. At the Office for National Statistics, we have been running a regular business impact of coronavirus survey, which has gone out to a large sample of businesses. We've just sent a new round out to a very large sample, and this enables us to look at, for example, the funds that small businesses have, and to also understand business sentiment. That survey publishes regularly, and if Greg Clark's committee is going to be looking at it, I would be absolutely delighted to bring some of the results to his committee. Thank you.
Right, thank you. And we'd be happy to share those on to you, Dave. Thank you very much for joining us. Alison Gudgeon from Christchurch and East Dorset.
Hi, thanks, Tracy. So I had a partial answer to my question already, which is about the science. So the science of comparative COVID, and how MPs look at the relative successes and failures of other countries in what is really a very fast-moving situation. So Sweden, for example, is used as Sweden's used as an example of low death rates alongside higher rates of social interaction. Do MPs know how to measure the effectiveness of other countries' responses relative to the UK's?
Thank you. Tom Twickenham is chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Tom, is this bowling you a one from left field?
No, it's fine. It is one of the things we've been looking at. But the problem classically with these questions is you're very often not comparing like with like, as you'll know. So we've looked at, for example, comparisons with Pakistan or with Nigeria, or indeed with Italy, and you find out that actually family structures and the way people live, and and the demographics of the society really do mean that you're not quite comparing as you thought you were. But I'm sure Ian Diamond has got some views on this, because the ONS does a hell of a lot of the stats on it. I'll open it up to him, but we've been asking the Foreign Office to collect from missions around the world to see what other people have done right, what they've done wrong, and to see where we can learn.
Okay. Is there a very brief answer to this, Ian?
There's a very long answer, but a very brief answer is that if you really do want to compare international death rates, simply the best way to do it is to compare the number of deaths this year compared with a 5-year average. In other words, the X for all causes, because definitions of what is a COVID death vary between countries. We have done that at a European regional level, and I will make sure that that piece is available, because I think it is an incredibly interesting piece, which also shows that the UK has not done as badly as people like to say very often.
Right, Chris Tyler made that point a little bit earlier on in our conversation, so I haven't got time to go back to him sadly on this, because it's really a very good area for us. Ellen McRae is from Edinburgh University Student Union. Ellen.
Thank you. So yes, at Edinburgh University Students Association, and I'm sure across other student unions across the UK, we are concerned that students living outside of universities' halls of residence aren't telling the university when they've tested positive for COVID-19 or have been told to isolate, and are underreporting symptoms. So my question is, how can MPs monitor how many students have tested positive for COVID-19?
Okay, I'm delighted that Tommy Shepherd's going to join us in just a moment, who's your MP in Edinburgh East. I want to take a comment from, from Lewis Martin, who's also a student down in Exeter, because it's a similar kind of question. Lewis.
Thanks, Tracy. Just my question is, following newly announced plans to get students home for Christmas and in the context of a mental health crisis for students, how does Parliament review government's claims on how coronavirus is spreading through student populations?
Okay, Tommy Shepherd, MP for Edinburgh East.
Hi, Tracy. I'm not entirely sure I can answer the specific question because there are other statisticians and scientists on the call which will know better than me, but I'm presuming that the data is there if we wanted to call for it and use it, both from the ONS surveys that are done and from the Test and Protect, or the UK equivalent as well. And of course, as I think Lewis just said, the opportunity does exist in the next few weeks and the next month to do a fairly mass testing of the student body throughout the UK and to gain an awful lot of additional data. So I think it would be possible to measure both the prevalence of COVID amongst the student population and to measure that against other demographic types. But I'm not entirely sure what benefit that would be, to be honest, because I think I can see why you would do that if it then leads to an operational change which could reduce that rate of infection, such as you say to people, well, we're completely going online for the next term, so don't come back, or whatever. Or if you had a radical approach that said, we're just going to have to accept that, you know, this academic year hasn't worked, and therefore it's cancelled, and we're going to come back and everybody gets their money back and all the rest of it. If you were going to do something radical like that related to the data in policy terms, then I can see why you would do it. But otherwise, just kicking around numbers about how many students are infected or what the rate of infection is among students, I think could be counterproductive and could lead to this sort of quite a negative view amongst many host communities of the student population that's within them,
Yeah.
which in turn will lead individual students to feel uneasy about coming forward and asking for help if they've actually had a positive test. So I think it's important to, you know, that we just put the message out that if you've got symptoms, get tested, and there's loads of help available. And I think probably what's important is that individual institutions and student unions are plugging into the testing centres, and that information is available right there at the point of testing about what to do if you're a student and what help is available.
Right, is there a very, we have 3 more questions I'd really love to fit in. Is there a very brief response to that from the ONS side of things?
Simply to say, it's very interesting you mentioned Exeter University. We are working very closely with Exeter University, both to monitor the incidents amongst students who are living both in halls of residence in Exeter and indeed in student housing outside of halls of residence, and also have surveys of behavioural aspects amongst students. And also there is some really interesting work which is monitoring wastewater. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lewis and Ellen. Moving to Paula Brown from Mid Derbyshire. Paula, I think we may be on mute.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, there you are.
Okay, hi. I'm a palliative care nurse and I support patients within a care home setting. And COVID has highlighted the discrepancies in support and guidance for NHS patients and nursing home patients. And I was wondering, is Parliament looking at any data to see if sharing of all the resources across health and social care, such as sharing training, guidance and funding, would provide a more efficient and safer service for vulnerable and elderly people?
Right, I should say your MP, Pauline Latham, did join us for a brief time. She's in and out of parliamentary debate at the moment. She did join us and did want to support your questions. I just wanted to register that. Hilary Armstrong, Baroness Armstrong, this is one for you, I think. Public services.
Yes, Parliament is looking at that and is very concerned about it. We are waiting for a white paper from the government, but we've now been waiting for that for a long time. The Economic Affairs Committee in the House of Lords did a report over, well, it's now about 15 months ago, recommending a new funding system. I don't think you just share the National Health Service system. I think you need a specific system for social care, but we're now at least 10 years having been promising for one, and we haven't got one, and it's hugely unfair across the country with a real postcode lottery in it too. But it is something that Parliament is looking at all of the time. And we looked at it briefly during our committee report. And the interesting thing was a lot of people said the problem was they really backed the National Health Service, but they weren't seen as equal partners. And they need to be seen as equal partners with the National Health Service in delivering care, particularly to the vulnerable and the elderly.
Thank you. Ed Humferson, Director General for Regulation at the UK Statistics Authority.
Thanks. As the sort of regulator of government statistics, one thing I'd say about this really, really good question is there's a lot of measurement of what goes on in the NHS, the staff, the resources, the number of operations, the waiting times. There's so much less measurement of what goes on in the social care range. And I think it's a really big gap. I think it's probably the biggest data gap we face. And if I can just say, one really simple example, every winter, in a normal winter, we know every day how many people are waiting 4 hours to get seen in accident and emergency. We don't have any daily figures on how many people are waiting for a home visit. And I think that until we correct that data mismatch, that lack of parity of data, it's going to be really hard to make the progress. Really, really important question, I think.
Thank you. And I saw that Penny Young, the House of Commons librarian, was really nodding there. So I'm guessing that's reflecting the number of questions that the library gets from MPs about that issue. I do have to move to our final question of this evening. Thank you all for staying with us the extra 5 minutes because we've managed to get through all of them. Miles Hillman from Leicestershire, your question, please.
Thank you, Tracy. How can MPs reconcile the UK's increasingly strict environmental standards in British agriculture with trade deals allowing low-cost food imports? Our environmental standards wrongly ban genetic editing of crops, but rightly limit nitrogenous fertilizers and restrict insecticides. But if we impose those standards on food inputs, it would limit supplies, push up costs. We live in a Marcus Bradford world of food poverty and food banks. Should we be pushing up food costs?
So your question is about how do MPs know how to support the food demand whilst introducing stricter standards? So are those two things. Philip Dunn.
Thank you. Miles, you slightly broke up there, but I think we got the gist of your question. The short answer is this is a very difficult area, and the legislation that the House of Commons has been putting through in the last couple of months there's a conflict between the new system that the agricultural bill, which has just passed both houses, which is putting in place a subsidy regime or support mechanisms to replace those in existence under the EU, the Common Agricultural Policy, which has been highly controversial in this country, with the trade bill, which is due to come shortly, and the various trade deals that we're going to do once we've left the EU with other countries. And that conflict is about the current, future and past relationships that have existed for agricultural produce getting access to this country. You will recall that when, perhaps, I think you and I are of a similar sort of age, that when we joined the EU, there were various protections for agricultural imports coming into the UK from former Commonwealth countries, in particular in the Caribbean. Now, those protections have existed to varying degrees throughout our membership of the EU. If you look at a supermarket shelf today, and you look at the origin of where the products have come from, many of those products are coming from countries that are not currently applying the same level of either animal welfare standards or product standards that we require for our farmers. And one of the problems that Parliament has been grappling with in coming up with the Agriculture Bill just now has been, if we impose the same standards overnight as proposed by a number of amendments to the bill, much of the existing produce sold in this country would suddenly become unable to be sold in this country. So what the government has introduced as a result of pressure from Parliament and the public, the NFU in particular with their million person petition, is a way of trying to provide advice to government in relation to food standards and in relation to the future trade bills. The Trade and Agriculture Commission, which will be giving advice as we look at each new trade bill to see what would be the implications if we applied UK standards to the produce grown in that country. And I think that will give some reassurance to UK consumers and farmers that standards can gradually be raised to meet our own production standards, but it can't happen overnight without causing massive disruption, not just in this country, but to growers and producers around the world.
Very interesting. Thank you. Philip, that's really interesting because it's the first time actually in all of these questions that we've had the suggestion of Parliament looking at the ongoing interplay of these kind of complex trade-offs. And it makes, I think just because by nature of the question, it really raises that. And I do think the complexity of that really just finishes us on a picture of what parliamentarians have to get themselves across in order to be on the floor and debating in the legislative side of things in a way that really asks all the cutting edge questions and the questions that get us to the bottom of things. So I think finishing on that was a really good one. I also should flag that tomorrow and the next day there is a rapid briefing for all MPs, and if you're constituents or other questioners this evening want to come along with you to that, that's fine. University of Nottingham is looking at this whole kind of combination of healthy plus sustainable plus carbon neutral food. A lot is being asked for that, and how do we make those trade-offs? So they're going to be briefing, 3-minute briefings with the researchers available. We've come to the end of the evening. I just know that there is so much expertise around all of those questions in many of the people who didn't get a chance to respond to them. It's been absolutely wonderful, and I'm really, really pleased and impressed at how many people have made the time this evening to come in and raise their questions, and often first time using Zoom, so thank you. It was quite a daunting prospect. It has been absolutely wonderful. I thank you. Chairs of select committees who I know are incredibly busy, MPs who I know also very incredibly busy, and all our experts likewise. I thank you for seeing the importance of being available for people's questions. And to everyone following on the live stream and everyone who raised those questions, those are all really big debates, and they all warrant quite a lot more discussion than we were able to give them this evening. But I do hope it's given you a flavour of the evidence demands that we have to make of Parliament, we should make of Parliament, and that they are making of themselves. And I hope also that you realise that the asking of those questions is the first step often to the sorts of issues that the select committees look at. It's you're the early warning system when you ask questions, whether you submit them through or raise issues, you submit them through parliamentary inquiries, you write to your MP, you contact your MP, you come into a forum like this. You're the early warning system as well for the issues that we need to look at, as well as the research community and other systems of monitoring that the ONS runs. The public too is an early warning system for Parliament. So we please continue to raise your questions and raise your issues. Thank you so much to our panel, our extensive panel this evening. Really appreciate your time and patience and staying with us for this longer time. And thank you. Please join us for the rest of Evidence Week. Thank you.